Okay, so there is a general, and again, it's not totally on topic, but it's on the topic anything in Torah. When we receive the Torah that Moses passed on to the Jewish people, and I don't want to make this the topic of today. I'm going to throw it out there. If we have more questions, we can do it another time. But it is fundamental that we stood at Sinai, and God gave 10 commandments, and then told Moses, "Come up on the mountain, and I'll give you the principles of Torah." And some of the details, but mostly it's the principles to be able to figure out the details that can be fleshed out later. And at the end of 40 years, that was in the beginning of a 40-year journey in the desert. At the end of 40 years, the Torah was completed and given to Moses. In that Torah, God tells Moses or tells us through the Torah, that we are supposed to listen to the great court, which is the halachic authority, which we no longer have, but it was called the Sanhedrin, which is a Greek word. The Torah is a different word. Is to not to swerve to the right or to the left from what they say. So what the Torah tells us is that Moses is a trusted recipient and conveyor of principles. You can think of them like Euclidean principles of geometry. The principle, Euclid didn't think of every example of how it was used. The principles are applied to modern examples that Euclid could never have fathomed. We see Moses similar, the same way. The idea is that Moses, the Mosaic, God gave Moses the Torah principles to pass on to a body of sages that the Torah talks about, 70 sages. And then that continued as a way of being able to apply Torah principles to new situations. And because some of the things that Moses didn't exist in Moses' time. And that's the way we see Torah. Now, we say they're human beings. However, if we believe in a God who created the world and runs the world and told us to trust this great court, just like I believe in God, I'm going to listen. God said, listen to them, figure that they're going to be saved from mistakes, at least when it comes to guiding us. So for example, therefore, when we were coming up on Hanukkah, and Hanukkah clearly happened more than 1,000 years after Sinai, and we do not believe that somehow there was a opening up of the heavens and God saying, here's a new mitzvah for you, Hanukkah. We don't. It was clearly ordained by the rabbis. That Jews around the world are going to stand by their Hanukkah lights, and they're going to make a blessing which says, "Blessed are you, God, who sanctified us with your commandments and commanded us to light the Hanukkah lights," which clearly God didn't. If you want to talk about as God, some voice from above, it's God did command us, because if the Torah tells us to listen to this body, central body of authority, and they told us that there's a mitzvah called a holiday called Hanukkah, we're in. And we even go that extra step, or that interesting step, and say it's God who commanded us to light the Hanukkah candles, which clearly it was humans who formulated this legislation, but that with divine backing, so to speak. So I know that's a big topic. I want to just throw it out there, maybe just to incite people to be able to write more emails. But I want to be able to get now to the and really the emails are great, and we can talk. There's just so much to talk about today. And on Sundays we've been going through the weekly Torah portion, and this first book of the Torah has 5 books, and this first book of the Torah is an unpacking and a fleshing out of our origins, our ancestors, our patriarchs and matriarchs. There are no mitzvahs per se, I guess, in the Torah, in the first book of the Torah, even though the Torah means instruction, it's an instruction manual, and mitzvahs are like which are directives, there's really the substance of it, but they don't begin until the second book of the Torah. There's so much to learn, though, from this first book of the Torah, and there we learn it not in the form of thou shalt and thou shalt not, but we look at the human lives there's a tremendous amount of our ancestors, and there's a tremendous amount of insight there, not only for us historically, say this is what our ancestors did, but us recognizing that that's in us too. There's an Abraham and Sarah within us, and Isaac and Rebecca. It's being directed to us as our personal user's manual. So in this, the unfolding where we've gotten is generation one is Abraham and Sarah. The next one is Isaac and Rebecca, Yitzchak and Rivka. And at the end of, not yesterday's Torah portion, what we read yesterday in the Torah, but the week before, Yitzchak and Rivka have twins, and those twins are a prodigal, good son and not good son, and they wrestle with each other, literally and figuratively, their perspectives in life. And Jacob, who's our ancestor, and the twin was named Esau. He has to run away from home because his twin brother wants to kill him. And he goes off to his unscrupulous uncle, Laban, and he builds a family, builds a business. And now, after a couple of decades, he's coming back home to Israel, which was called Canaan at the time. And he wants to come home. But his brother hears that he's coming, and he's there to meet him with 400 armed soldiers, and there's going to be a confrontation. In this week's Torah portion, which we're not going to talk about today, but it's fascinating, there is the episode of Jacob wrestling with an angel, which is how Jacob was given another name, Israel. That's where Israel comes from. And Israel, when we say that the children of Israel, we mean the children of Jacob and his wives. He had 4 wives. And that's in this Torah portion. We're not going to get there. And he has a successful meeting with his brother Esau, and everything's peaceful. And then there's a very troublesome episode that the Torah records, and it's that Jacob and his wives at that point have 11 sons and 1 daughter. The daughter's name is Dinah. Dinah is in an area which is today like what the Arabs call Nablus, Shechem, and she's very pretty. And the son of the ruler, who's his name Shem, I guess he named the area after his child, takes her and rapes her, which is obviously a horrible thing. What the Torah tells us is that 2 of her brothers, Shimon and Levi, what happened was they came to the this was horrible, and so the father, Shechem's father, who's like the leader of the region, comes to Jacob and says, "We got something going here. Calm down. Let them marry, and then we would like to mingle with you. Good. You're a nice family, and we want to let's not get bent out of shape." And well, so Jacob's 2 sons say, 2 of the sons say, well, the problem is we can't allow we can't intermarry with uncircumcised people. So if you circumcise yourselves, we're in. So they circumcise themselves, and while they're in pain from the surgery, Shimon and Levi, they massacre. Not a pretty scene. And Jacob calls them to task, says, "How could you have done this?" Their father, and they say, "What will our sister be like a prostitute?" It's a very painful, and especially from our point in history, say that this violence is a horrible thing. We're not going to get into the violence too much, just a little bit, but we want to talk about a more specific insight of this. Obviously, we're not going to skirt the issue, but where we're going to focus on is not directly on how they could have allowed it. They did it. So it's not something we look up to. At the same time, it's a piece of Torah, and there is some resonance here. So let's start with text 1a. I'm going to share the screen. Oh, sorry, it's 139. So text 1a is from this week's Torah portion. It says, it came to pass on the third day, when the inhabitants of Shechem were all in pain, that Shimon and Levi, two of Jacob's sons, brothers of Dinah, each man took up a sword. They came upon the city with confidence and slew every man. Text 1b is what I said before, as Jacob calls them to task, how could you possibly have done this horrible thing? And they say, will our sister be made into a harlot? We stood up for our sister. They violated her. Now, just 1 second, sorry, gotta keep track of this. Let's just made into harlot. Now,
interesting, they said they violated her, not he violated her.
So they came, well, our sister made into harlot. Where do you see the day? Where do you see the day? Yeah. Okay, so there are a number of, I don't know if you have it in the book here. We have it doesn't seem to be on the PowerPoint on 140. 4 different angles. Again, this is not the focus of today's discussion, but 4 different angles about what were they thinking? Not to condone what Shimon and Levi did, but they're well-bred kids. What was their thought process that this was okay? So Maimonides tells us that the people should have established a court of justice and brought the prince up on charges for what he did. Failure to do so made them all complicit. Some time passed. People were letting him go, so they said, "You're all part of the same cabal," and they went after all. Nachmanides says that the people were guilty of many other capital sins, such as idolatry, adultery, and other abominations. So therefore, they took care of them in one fell swoop. Okay, again, not an excuse, just talking about what they were thinking. Rabbi Chaim ben Attar, the Chaim, says they intended to kill Shechem, but the people came to his defense and found themselves in a war against the entire male population. So therefore, what it really was, it became into they jumped into a fight, and the other people in town, and that's how this began. And then finally, it says Shimon and Levi learned that the people came to regret their circumcision and were preparing to make war against Yaakov's family. And since they were preparing to come after them, they preemptively stood up. Now, again, this is not the topic of today. It should be a troublesome episode because it's our if it's not our direct ancestor, it's David's a Levi, so he's going to take some more responsibility than the rest of us here, because this is my uncle. It's your dad. But the idea is it's a troublesome thing, but that's not what we're focusing on now. We're going to focus on something which is, it seems it's more ancillary, but it's a whole different topic that we want to get into. And this is on text 2, which is 141. We find in the Talmud, Rashi tells us, Rashi, the primary comment on the Torah, in all the Torah we find no instance in which someone younger than 13 is called a man. However, we do find that the Torah describes a 13-year-old as a man, as the passage states. Shimon and Levi, 2 of Jacob's sons, each man took up a sword. We have it by tradition that Shimon and Levi were 13 years old at that point. One who wants to calculate it may calculate it and will conclude that they were indeed 13. Okay, so here, a few different things. First of all, there is a tradition that we have in Jewish tradition going back thousands of years, that for a boy age of what we're going to call majority, whatever the responsibility is 13. For a girl, that's 12. Bar and bat mitzvah. That's the way it's been for thousands of years. It doesn't say that in the Torah. But what the Talmud points out is that while it doesn't say that in the Torah, if you do the math of that we know of historically, Shimon and Levi in this episode of wiping out this city, the men in the city of Shechem, they were 13. They're twins. And if that's the case, and the Torah calls them men. So here we find that the Torah, you can see a scriptural verse which supports this idea that the 13-year-old is from a man, is for a boy is the age of majority, and we have the tradition again that a girl's at 12. Now, so from here, if one looks, I do bar mitzvahs all the time. So if I was sitting with a kid and we talk about bar mitzvah, we say it's 13, 12, they don't ask questions. But if they want to ask where can you anchor this in scripture? It's not a really, I like to guide the kids in a way of thinking about empathy and community and higher thinking. It's not it's odd, or at least curious that the Torah would anchor this idea of bar mitzvah of 13 in this really distasteful episode. Yeah.
A few weeks back, when we were talking about Abraham being 90, 100, we were talking about how years weren't really calculated at the time the same way as they might be now.
Okay.
Now we're talking 2 generations later, and now we're saying 13 is 13.
See, someone brought up here, yes, you're talking about people living till 180, or that's already little. Going back earlier in the Torah, they're living 900. And someone asked if he could say, I think it was David, if he could say that the years the years were calculated differently. And I said, you can. I don't. And I stick with the years, and I don't feel forced to do that. I think that life has changed a lot, and therefore it's whether it was 13 or 180, it was people were living differently. So it's for me, 180 is 180 and 13 is still 13. But you could say, but 13-year-olds, they're not going to have the strength to do this type of thing. I'll go back to this idea that people lived in different kinds of ways.
Sure. Yeah. It was just more from a calculation perspective.
Yeah.
Because, people might not have even lived past 30 back.
There are certainly those who say that. I don't feel forced to say it because the Torah is, the rabbis of the Talmud had plenty of opportunity to say that, and for them, certainly a year is a year, and they were not living this long, right? They were living less than us, right? So I'm gonna stick with this, but I leave room for it. But
They said somebody was 900 was 80, and somebody 13 would be 2.
yeah. So I think that's what Eileen was asking. So if you're gonna go with that, then this is dog years.
Yeah, Rebecca here came up with 6 to 1.
6 to 1. Yeah. So if the 6 to 1 doesn't work here, so it's.
But I think what Rabbi Mendy said last time is true. If you go back in history, people did die of illnesses, but people lived longer. During my grandmother's time, there were people that lived until 140. Okay, and that wasn't too long ago.
Your grandmother's time, really?
During my grandmother's time,
Where did she live?
Morocco. 140.
No.
You're talking
Probably less
100
polluted.
years ago, 100 years ago, in Morocco, where everything was made by hand. They had no factories. There was no pollution. They lived in a farm. In those times, they lived like from the land, basically. She grew up in a farm, and there were people that lived very late, 120, 110.
I didn't know that. Wow,
Yeah,
that's very recent.
No, that's 100 years ago.
Well, in the scope of history, that's very recent.
No. Whether my grandmother was mistaken, because in those days there were no birth certificates.
Right.
So you don't know that, but you do see on TV people over 100 celebrating, their birthdays are 120. I think recently there was a woman in California, 120 years old.
Yeah,
celebrating.
I think we've done a lot to diminish our capacity to live, but I don't know. I mean, that's something of an imponderable. Looking at the Torah, when they say 13, I'm going to go with 13 here, but it's hell of a 13. Most of our 13-year-olds can't do this. Now,
according to Book of Records, the oldest person died at 121. It would be interesting how people in Morocco were able to live till age of 140. Find it hard to believe, with all due respect.
yeah, so Nadia, I was going to say, I'm used to people in Russia saying that I don't know how old I am. I don't have any record. So I don't know. I actually did remember speaking to someone who was doing a lot of research and came up with is working with Yale. And he said he feels that the human body is designed. He's a Jewish guy, but he had very little connection. He was saying that he feels the human body, if it's left to its own devices and if it's not, there's no interference, it's designed to live around 120 years. But things get in the way. We get in our own way. Anyway, but this is now turn to the idea of bar mitzvah. Now, for those of us who have had bar mitzvahs here, bat mitzvahs here, no, we do things in a way that's different. That's not the point of today, but I'm just talking about we do things that are not the norm out there in the American Jewish community. Why? Because A, we didn't think it was working well for the kids. B, because there is no chapter in Jewish law that tells you how to have a bar bat mitzvah. Bar and bat mitzvah are seen as developmental stages. It's actually a developmental stage that a girl reaches at 12 and a boy reaches at 13 because girls mature quicker. What is the developmental stage? The Talmud describes it as achieving a certain level of awareness. The term it's used is da'at, which is sometimes translated as knowledge, not a good translation. Certainly not for our purpose. It's not an accurate translation. Da'at means connecting with an idea, processing an idea so that it matters. That knowledge, but people translate as knowledge, when you say Adam knew Eve, knowing in the biblical sense, Adam knew Eve, it wasn't knowing, right? It was connecting physically. It was physical intimacy. Why does the Torah use the term dat, knowledge, which is a cognitive thing? They're not prudes. The Torah talks later on about having physical intimacy, because the term dat means to connect intimately with an idea, and therefore, if we have a capacity to not only register cognitively what is important, like if I give my 5-year-old grandson my phone, I say, can you bring it next door to grandma? It's really important, be careful with it. That's pretty stupid of me, because he's 5, and if it's really all that important, I can bring it myself. But there's something, because I can't really expect him to process what this is and how important it is. He's a good kid, he may very well do it, but there's a risk there. At what point is a child, does the child reach a point of recognizing other? I mean, this is part of there's a science of this. And then not only recognizing other, that other has feelings, and recognizing that things beyond them, and being able to cognate and to understand, and then relate to it and have it matter. To hear about what's going on in Ukraine. They may be able to process what's going on, but to actually feel something for it, care, they might. But the skill of the tool develops as we grow older. That's called what we're going to call maturity. it allows us more, and the idea of also to understand higher ideals, that there's something beyond what we feel. And therefore, for a child, you say, don't do that, even if it looks good, because I'm going to punish you. That's really the way it happens. To say, don't do that because it's immoral, because it's wrong. Again, you can find an 8-year-old where that works. But for a 13 and 12-year-old, we're say there, it may not work there either, but at least they have the capacity to understand that life isn't only about what they're feeling or what they want. There's something bigger out there, and there's morality. There's what God wants. That's what matters to my parents. So this is the idea of the maturity we talk about bar and bas mitzvah. And that's why we do our things a little differently. We focus on that, and not. I don't want to get into what we do here. It's a fun conversation, but it's the idea of bar mitzvah is not about a ceremony. It never was. Bar mitzvah is about growing older, and we create a ceremony to celebrate that. So and we call it our child's attention to the beauty of what they believe and the fact that they can connect with it. So
I have one
sure.
question. Teenagers are usually very impulsive,
Yep.
you know?
Yep.
So maybe is it that they mentioned the age that they were 13 to show that they were sort of teenagers and they were impulsive in their decision to go and attack them?
I think that's a good point. I think clearly they were impulsive, and there's a lesson here of what not to do. I accept that. I think where we're going to try and find here is also something that we can take home, not only about what not to do, but the intensity of their feeling.
But because
They're 13, they're kids,
teenagers,
they're kids. At the end of the day,
Are they
kids are kids.
responsible?
Even in Torah, the punishments are only you have to be 20.
Right.
No one can be punished for something they did wrong at 13 or 12.
Except here. Because they're saying that they were considering attacking.
Yeah.
So they were considering, but they weren't acting.
Oh yeah, but no, but those people, it doesn't say they were kids. But those were adults. The one, the Shem who did the raping wasn't 13. But for Shimon and Levi, these two brothers, they were 13, and they clearly they were impulsive in that way. They would not have been tried if that horrible thing, if they in Torah law, it would have been absolutely forbidden to do what they did. But actually, could have been no punishment to minister on a child. Now, not a child, you're bar mitzvah. For the level of being able, for cognition, to be able to hold someone responsible for the level of punishment is actually 20 in the Torah. But here it's about being able to, I guess, find empathy, to find a connection to that, what actually means something to you. And let's explore that a little bit, what that means. In text 3, it says, the commandments became obligatory at the age of 13 because that is when we reach maturity in terms of understanding and empathy. So what does that mean? If I can tell a girl at age 12 or a boy at age 13 to say, God loves you, and God gave us a Torah, and God really cares what we do, and therefore doing this is important to God. It's fair in Jewish tradition for me to accept that this young girl or boy can process that. Now we have thousands of years of people not caring, but the fact is at least there's something there. You can expect it. It's unfair to expect that type of caring from a 10-year-old. From a 12 and 13-year-old, at least they have the tools, the emotional tools, the emotional intelligence. Now, so on to text 4a. We have here, also this is from the 5th of Rebbe. He gets into what this empathy, this da'at means. To empathize is to really know. One can have a concrete understanding of something and still be unable to experience it emotionally. For example, wise children can understand something well, but they can't experience it emotionally, despite being intellectually sharp and smart. This is because children lack the ability to really know. Again, know in this sense, namely to develop emotional intimacy and feel the subject on a personal emotional level. So if I tell children, if you know, my father comes from Brazil, and I tell my young children that this is what went on in Brazil, even though they've never been there, but they know grandpa came from Brazil, they can feel some relevance. That's one thing. But if I say went on in Rwanda, they may be able to understand what I'm saying, but for them to feel, either they can or they can't. But you can't really expect it. For someone who has this dot, in other words, 12 or 13 for a girl or boy, if they're really going to get into it, well, they can understand there's a human there. They may not look like them, they may have never been there, but they can feel, they can empathize. The same applies to worldly affairs, such as wealth or power. Children might be bright and smart. They might understand wealth and power, but they aren't emotionally attached to it. They don't have the same relationship with money that adults do. The same is true of the other side of the coin. Children might understand the problems associated with lowliness and poverty, but they aren't distressed by such problems. They don't feel them as adults do. If you show a child suffering in front of their eyes, hopefully they can relate to it. But if you talk to them about it, it's conceptual. It's again, some children may be better equipped, but as a rule, you can't talk about them being able to empathize until they reach a certain level of being able to conceptualize. And it's not only they understand, but it touches them, and that starts at 12, 13. Let's go to 4b. From the Rabbi, it says, children lack the ability to perceive and feel how precious and valuable a mitzvah is, and how much we lose when we fail to observe the divine commandments. So for a child to do a mitzvah, what we can do is what goes on outside now in Hebrew school. You dress it up with fun and games and baking, whatever it is. Why? Because you have to teach a child according to their way. You bring in children and say, there's a God, and God really cares about you're way over their heads. You want to find relevance, help them find a relevant hook. And if through giving them, and this has been Jewish tradition for thousands of years, Maimonides talks about it, it's an idea of giving, helping children feel good and cared for, and giving them good things to eat, and then in that teach them you're going to be open to something. Why? Because for the adults, you can say, listen, we're going to talk about something. I know it's Sunday morning. You could be playing tennis, take some time off. Fine. They'll show up. You make Hebrew school voluntary, it can be empty. Because why would I go? I got things to do. Or even playing PlayStation. So here it takes a certain amount of maturity to feel that there's something beyond the immediate, and to that there's something bigger than me, and perhaps I want to study about it, or to observe the commandments. That starts, we say, it's 12 and 13. Here they bring in some scientific snippets, text 5a. The notion that a shift in a child's development occurs around the age of 12 fits with popular models of developmental psychology. One notable example is the work of Jean Piaget, who mapped out 4 stages of a child's cognitive development. He called the final stage, beginning around 11, the formal operational stage. While children in early years mostly used inductive reasoning, drawing general conclusions from personal experience and specific facts, at this age, meaning the age of around 11, they become capable of deductive reasoning, drawing specific conclusions from abstract concepts using logic. While children tend to think very concretely and specifically in earlier stages, at around age 12, they become capable of abstract thought and begin to consider possible outcomes and consequences of actions. It's developmental. So in this sense, and we'll talk about it also, bar and bat mitzvah are not a Jewish thing. It's a human thing that we celebrate today. But it's about development. Text 5b. A parallel to Piaget's work in the field of cognitive development is Lawrence Kohlberg's work on moral development. Kohlberg found, oops, I'm sorry about this. I apologize. That's the notion of child development. I'll just leave it up for a minute, and then I'll go down to the next one. A parallel to Piaget's work in the field of cognitive development is Lawrence Kohlberg's work on moral development. Kohlberg found that until adolescence, children are motivated primarily by self-interest. They behave well because they're rewarded and avoid misbehaving to avoid punishment. As children enter adolescence, they become more concerned about maintaining relationships and take other people's perspectives and intentions into account when making decisions. They also begin to conform to social standards of behavior and understand right from wrong. When I was a kid in elementary school, I probably didn't realize that the teacher's an actual human being with feelings. I was okay in school. I didn't, I remember first time I realized that it matters to them as human beings whether their school let us know they or not. It's like they like live there. I just didn't think of that. It's just, I don't know what age it was. I remember it was like, oh my gosh, that could be my mother. We grow and we start. This isn't obviously a knock on kids. It's a reality of development. And here we'll go to text 6. Throughout childhood and into adolescence, the cortical areas of the brain continue to thicken as neural connections proliferate. In the frontal cortex, gray matter volumes peak at approximately 11 years of age in girls and 12 years of age in boys, reflecting dendritic overproduction. Subsequently, rarely used connections are selectively pruned, making the brain more efficient by allowing it to change structurally in response to the demands of the environment. So I think this is obviously very scientific language, but the idea is as we grow older, also the brain starts to empty out some of the static, so to streamline so we can process better. Neural connections that survive the pruning process become more adept at transmitting information through myelination. Myelin, which is a sheath of fatty cell material wrapped around neuronal axons, acts as insulation for neural connections. This allows nerve impulses to travel throughout the brain more quickly and efficiently and facilitates increased integration of brain activity. So the reason they brought this here is because there is the idea that in many ways, like I said before, people say, I was never bar mitzvah, I was never bat mitzvah. That's cool. I'm not going to argue about that. There's no such thing as being bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. Time, bar mitzvah is a person, they didn't have a service, they hit, someone will say to me, Rabbi, I was never bar mitzvah. They say, did you hit 13? Mazel tov, we're done. You want to have a party, we can make it a party at 40, at 50, 70, it doesn't make a difference. It's beautiful, the parties are good. But the idea of bar and bat mitzvah is that it's about the developmental stage. So there is nothing no holy water, a holy formula we have to utter, or holy water we have to sprinkle. We use it as an important time, especially because we're going to have a big party. So I got your attention. Now we're going to study. We're going to think about it. We're going to make something special out of it. And it's a beautiful thing to do. That we allow a girl and a boy to recognize the beauty of growing older. But what we do is really up to us because it happens. Again, I don't want to stick on us, but for us, we really try to have each bat mitzvah and bar mitzvah kid come here on their actual birthday, Jewish birthday, which for them is usually just a regular Monday. But they want to come into the office and say l'chaim, give them a cookie, whatever, and to be able to recognize that today is a bat mitzvah, by the way, and a bar mitzvah are a person, it's not a bat mitzvah means a daughter of a responsibility of mitzvah, and bar is Aramaic for son of a mitzvah. Said today you are a bat mitzvah. Today you are a bar mitzvah. We're gonna have a party in 6 weeks. Great, we're gonna celebrate. But we're celebrating is what happened today. It doesn't become a bat mitzvah at the party or even at the service. Okay. So now, having said all of that, let's get a little deeper for what this can mean for us, because none of us here are celebrating bar and bat mitzvahs. And this was chosen for a reason to be able to see insight for ourselves. So let's think about this bar and bat mitzvah thing. As I said before, from one perspective, bar and bat mitzvah are purely developmental stages. And in fact, rabbis say it applies to everyone, Jew and non-Jew alike. It's a comment on growing up. It's not a Jewish thing, it's a human thing that we're celebrating in Judaism. There are other opinions that part of what Moses gave us from Sinai was this understanding that bar mitzvah boy 13 and 12 for a girl. We can say, oh, why? Because of development. But that's that's just us rationalizing it. It's something that we got. It's like kosher. People rationalize, don't rationalize, doesn't make a difference, but the Torah doesn't give us a reason. This is something passed on to us. So in text 7, we have that opinion from a great rabbi. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for reminding me. I need those. Text 7, it's from a great rabbi of the 13th and 14th century. With respect to your query, how do we know that we only become liable for our transgressions at the age of 13, but not before? Again, liable means to God, that's not punishable. Know that this is a ruling that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai and was passed down orally through the generations. For God taught Moses a minimum measure for every requirement in the Torah. There's a Talmudic idea that the requirements, the things that need a measurement, are passed down from Sinai, and he says this is part of it. So we have in Jewish thinking 2 ways of looking at bar bat mitzvah. One is that it's under a logical stage in human development, not accepting something ex cathedra. The other one is from God. You can understand it later, you can rationalize it, but it's from God. Now, why does that make a difference to us? Take a look in text 8. And the Rabbi once pointed out, he says, these 2 opinions about the starting point of our obligation to worship God represent 2 entry points into divine worship. According to the first opinion, worship should begin from a standpoint of reason and knowledge. The ability to serve God this way depends directly on the state of our intellectual and emotional maturity. Thus, we become obligated to perform mitzvahs when we mature enough to intuit the meaning of the mitzvahs and to relate to them emotionally. According to this opinion, it follows that the portal to divine worship is reason and knowledge. Second opinion is that the 13-year-old accepts the yoke of mitzvahs in obedience to a divine edict related to Moses at Sinai. According to this opinion, it follows that the portal to divine worship is discipline and obedience. We have 2 tracks that we follow in Torah, in Jewish life. And these 2 tracks, people fall into usually one or the other, and the healthiest is to combine them. And one of the things that what the Rebbe is saying here is that these 2 opinions are really 2 dimensions of one opinion. When I do a mitzvah, why do I do it? Because it makes me feel good? I hope it makes me feel good. But what if it doesn't make me feel good? If it's a mitzvah, years ago, I was we always had a good relationship with Temple HaShalom in Warren, and we used to go there for programs all the time. But once a year, I used to go as for their course on comparative religion, and I was the live specimen of Orthodox. So I had to come with my black hat and my beard I always carry. So and the kids, I knew the kids, and we would speak. It was actually like a bar bat mitzvah class.
Excuse me, is that conservative? or
Reform. Yeah. And so one day, it wasn't a complicated thing, but one day I was in a rush. I hadn't thought about it as I was driving over. I was thinking, what's going to be my entry point into talking to the kids? So when I walked in, I asked them all, who knows what the word mitzvah means? I'm in a Hebrew school, right? So everybody raises their hands. What does it mean? A good deed. So the teacher happened to have been an Israeli. So I said, I'm going to tell you a little secret. And your teacher knows Hebrew better than I do. So let her correct me if I'm wrong. The word mitzvah does not translate into good deed. The word mitzvah as a word, grammatically and linguistically, doesn't mean good deed. So she started laughing, she didn't know where I was going. I said, the word mitzvah means a commandment, which meant nothing. So, they didn't really care. So, but I'm going to explain to you why it makes a difference. I said, does anyone here believe that murder is okay? God forbid. So what if I told you there's a tribe in New Guinea, totally self-secluded, and they're actually democratic. They elect leaders, and what was decided is that for the sake of the tribe, any child that's born with blue eyes has to be put to death. It's not going to work. It horrifies the kids. I said, do you think we sitting here in New Jersey have the right to say they're wrong? And about half the kids, if I remember correctly, said, it's not our business. How can we tell them? They've decided, they have their own moral code. It's a pretty sophisticated way of thinking. They have their own moral code. Who are we? Don't bring it to Jersey. But who are we to judge them? So I said, I get you. Now, what happens if a society comes together and they decide it's okay to kill Jews? Nobody says that's okay. So, but what's the difference? Why do we have the right, even looking back at history, to say if a society indeed decided, let's say it was even democratically, that they don't like this type of person, those ones they're not bringing here, why don't they have the right to decide their own ethics? And the reason, I said, is because it's not for us to decide. It's wrong. Murder's wrong. It's wrong in New Guinea. It's wrong in Germany. It's wrong in New Jersey. And it's not, we don't refrain from murder because we got together at a town meeting and said we think it's wrong. Because that's terrible. Because then if we think it's right, God forbid, then that's where we go. There is something higher than this. Now, the fact that we find murder abhorrent is wonderful because that means our logic and our emotions are in sync with a higher idea, a higher law of thou shalt not murder. But the idea is that it's not just because we think it's a good thing. So my point to them was, if you look at mitzvah as a good deed, it makes you feel warm and fuzzy. Good. What happens when it doesn't make you feel warm and fuzzy? No need. You do it's if the attraction is that it makes sense to you, it makes you feel good, then you're in danger of what happens if you don't feel good. A command is a command. Commandment means this is something I gotta do. I'm not in the mood, too bad. Or I feel like I'm really angry and I want to do it. The commandment was don't do it. It's either go back to management and get a license to do it, or forget it. You can't do that. You got to find another way to deal with your frustration. So in Torah, there are these two things. Torah doesn't want us to be brainless, doesn't want us to suspend our critical thinking, God forbid. But Torah doesn't want us to make our whole lives dependent on our critical thinking, because our critical thinking is human, it's going to be flawed. So there's two things. There's the mitzvah idea. Listen, this is what I got from management. This is the way we live. That's the surrender. And then, because God blessed us with brains and emotions, we want to tackle that idea. And so make it our own and make it matter to us. And that's going to be a very helpful engine in actually acting that way. But it's not the foundation of what we are, just because we decided. Because we can decide differently. Human beings are fickle. Here, what the Rebbe is saying is, when it comes to bar mitzvah, our rabbis gave us two ways in, because there are two ways in to be able to educate the child. One is that bar mitzvah is from Sinai. And tell the child, we have a way of life. God gave it to us. For Jews, this is the way we live. But then there's another thing. It makes sense. Look at yourself. You're growing older. The maturity, things matter to you. That's good. It's important. It's a different angle on it. It's to try to bring to the child or to ourselves this idea where it's not just I do it because I'm Jewish. It actually matters to me because I thought it through. But if that doesn't work, what can I do? This is, there's nothing I could do. This is what God told me to do. So, to take this one step further, text 9, 149. This is from the previous Rebbe, Lubavitcher Rebbe, who suffered a lot in communist Russia, and he wrote this. This is from a time when he was he was there and being persecuted, and a couple of years after this was 1925. A couple of years after this, he was in prison and sentenced to death, and then thrown out of the country. So he's speaking to his Russian Jewry, text 9. Intellectual Jews must set aside their deductions and refuse to follow their reason and knowledge. Because there were so many reasons not to keep Torah, because it was so difficult. This is because they're liable to stray, God forbid, by following the prevailing culture of our time and place, and conclude that we must change our practice. With time, this can cause them to stray completely from the truth path, God forbid. It might begin with a minor adjustment, but it can lead slowly and progressively to a bitter end, God forbid. We must therefore be fiercely determined, even to the point of self-sacrifice, not to stray even an iota, God forbid, from the code of Jewish law. Torah is eternal to every era and epoch, so we must stand firm and never feel shame before those who mock us. So this is something that the previous Rebbe, he lived through very difficult times, and it's from the American point of view, I can say, beat my chest and say what I would have done, but he was encouraging people not to cow before the communists and to take the convenient way out and do the right thing. Mendel's great grandfather is one of a group of 10 Hasidim who made a pact with the previous Rebbe, said that they will continue to spread Judaism even to the point of losing their lives. They will never give up on doing that. And many of them made it out, but there was a certain attitudinality there. Text 10. Now, this is from Code of Jewish Law. It says the primary and final state of the sacred soul's entry into the bodies at the age of 13 for a boy and 12 for a girl. This is why they become obligated in the Torah's commandments at that age. Okay, so now, just to cap this off, we say that the soul blossoms at Bar and Bat Mitzvah. And I tell this to the kids also. What does it mean? It's their soul tools come into form. And one of the important tools is the tool of self-discipline, the tool of empathy, and the tool of being able to conceptualize, and things matter. And when things matter, we should point our lives in the direction that matters. So now, this is all about Bar Mitzvah. And it's all about ourselves also, of our own maturity, our own thinking. But why in the world what do we learn? Why does the Torah anchor this to such a story where we tell the kids, don't do this, don't act so impulsive? The concern, the text 11. Sorry. 151. The concern, will our sister be made into a harlot, was so distressing to Shimon and Levi that they responded like strangers, like people who were not the sons of Jacob. They lost themselves. They were so consumed by the stress over the violation of the sister that their only choice was each man took up his sword. They obviously lost their judgment. And that's wrong, period. But now let's look at the fact that they were consumed with what? Feeling for their sister. This is precisely why we derive the age of Bar Bat Mitzvah from this passage. It is a message from every Bar Bat Mitzvah child, which includes all Jews at the beginning stages of their spiritual progression. The lesson is that when we stray after our hearts and eyes with lustful urges and are tempted to sin, we face the risk of being made into a harlot. But just as harlotry drives a wedge between the woman and her husband, so does sin form a barrier between us and God. When we are confronted by some temptations, we mustn't tolerate any rational justification or moderate response. Our only response can be stubborn resistance to sin, even to the point of self-sacrifice. Only after being inspired to self-sacrifice do we have the luxury of serving God in a fashion that follows the reasoning and the measured pace of the Torah's dictates. However, for our reasoned service to God to endure on our very first approach, even at the age of bar mitzvah, must be stubborn to determination that transcends all reason. So the reason offered for why did we have this 13 anchor to this story, because it's a question, is that perhaps it's to tell a child things should matter to you. And if you see injustice, it should matter. And it may be inconvenient for you to stand up anyway. Don't do what they did. They lost it. But standing up is a good thing. And standing up to, even if it's standing up to power, it's okay. So the idea is that let it matter. And in that sense, it's a good lesson for the bar mitzvah. It's not a good lesson for what they did. It's a good lesson that even at that age, things can matter, and they would put themselves in a difficult position because they were going to stand up for justice.
What if a child tells you, okay, there's, wars going on where there are injustices?
Yeah.
Do we get involved in those wars? How do you handle that?
So I think, if my child asked me, I would say that you don't want, listen, especially Jews, we should be sensitive to the idea of people who don't have a dog in that fight, standing up for people being oppressed and being vulnerable. So if they're asking about the Russia-Ukraine thing, yeah, I don't see myself as a warmonger, but I would say how do you just stand by and see? I mean, the world watched this. We all saw the mobilization, and here they're going in, and it's not like they're just taking land, which is a tougher problem. People are suffering. I have friends who are living there. So my kids are not that young. Will say, I don't know how you don't do something. I don't think there's really a choice. Now, how do you go and send your Air Force in to shoot down planes? It's not that's a more of a political decision. But for us to sit and not do anything and say it's not our fight, I have a problem with it. Can we put ourselves out? Should we jeopardize our own security for that? No, I wouldn't say that. But I think the main thing is, I would want my kids, it should matter to them. And sometimes things matter to you, and there's nothing you can do but pray. But if it doesn't matter, we have a problem.
Is Chabad involved in helping people?
Sure.
Get out and...
Sure, we have people there. Yeah, there was Chabad. I don't know. There must have been like 45 Chabad centers there, and it was actually a big issue because I sit on an oversight board for the Chabad institutions, and we wanted them all to get out, and they didn't want to leave. And it was getting very dangerous. So, and we had conference calls with them, and they said, "How do we leave our communities? Because we have American or Israeli passports, we can get out, and these people are left, and there was real suffering going on."
How did they handle it?
Well, we told them that the women and children have to leave today, and once the women and children are leaving, they weren't going to leave the men behind. There were a few cities which were allowed to stay through everything. There are a few cities where there was minimal attack, and they were ready to leave if it got bad. Most of them left, and then at this point, most of them have gone back. Most of them gone back. Even Kharkiv went back because it's. I mean, there are some areas. I have a friend who lived under Russian rule for a while in Herson.
Is there anything to go back to?
You have people. They have these other communities. This is their family. They felt terrible leaving, and they left with two orphanages, because some of them. One of the things that goes on there a lot is the Chabad runs orphanages, or a lot, but that's what's necessary there more than in an American situation. So 2 orphanages were airlifted to Israel. Schools went to Germany and Hungary. It was as much as you could get out, you got out. But then it became illegal for any men to leave. Ukrainian men were not allowed to leave.
Right.
Text 12. And this, I think, that this is the final one. Oops. Jewish children reach maturity at 13 years of age. This is from the Rebbe, unlike other nations where the age of adulthood is 20, 21, 18, whatever. So the Rebbe called attention to a Jewish perspective, where we also say, no one thinks a 13-year-old can get a license or get married. The reason is because nations formed a national identity by first settling on a common land rather than wandering about or shepherding. Then they appoint a king and finally establish a constitution and laws. It's about the national identity, the land, their security, and for that you need people who are mature and have the capacity physically and mentally. History of the Jewish people is the opposite. As soon as they left Egypt while still in the desert, we weren't a people that began to follow Torah and its commandments. This was their foundation and portal into nationhood. This is why Jews don't enter into adulthood when they are 20 and strong enough to defend the land. Rather, by the age of 13, where they are mature enough to begin to understand the great privilege and responsibility of being a Jew, that it matters. So now, key points is the first one is the legal age of Bar Mitzvah 13 or Bar Mitzvah 12 is informed by the story in the Torah of Shimon and Levi killing the entire city of Shechem. The Torah's concept of maturity, as far as religious responsibility is concerned, is not intellectual maturity, but emotional, spiritual maturity, the ability to relate to things outside of oneself. Empathy is a hallmark of this maturity, and it begins at the onset of the teenage years, which accounts for the ages of Bar and Bat Mitzvah. Modern science has uncovered physiological, neurological changes that reflect this. Understanding and empathy, however, are not enough to be a Jewish adult. First and foremost, it requires fierce loyalty that transcends understanding, guaranteeing loyalty to God despite all odds. The story of Shimon and Levi reflects this tenacity and transcendence. And finally, the concept of maturity. I see that someone asked something on the chat. Let me check that out in a second. Flows from the Torah as opposed to other cultures that value other things, which accounts for the older ages of maturity in their cultures. I'm sorry, I missed this. There's a chat and I didn't see it before. Question.
Rabbi, could you go over that that last point? You kind of went through it a little bit quickly.
Concept.
Yeah,
what I just read.
Yeah, the concept.
Yeah, I'm just. Okay. This concept of maturity flows from the Torah as opposed to other cultures that value other things. For example, land ownership, which accounts for the older ages of maturity in other cultures, because it wasn't about being old enough for the army or to protect the land. It was really about being able to understand and have Judaism matter. And here's a question here we have. Dinah was younger than Shimon and Levi. Was this a child rape? Was Dinah at least 12 to be eligible to marry? Well, it was a child rape, but the thing is, and in those days, it wasn't necessarily the 12 old enough to marry either. Oops, I just lost it. I apologize.
Did they mention her age? I don't think so, right?
It doesn't say her age, no. But we make calculations, okay, based on what we think. I'm not getting this. For some reason, I'm having a hard time seeing the second question. Let me try this. What about further?
The scroll bar on the right-hand side.
Yeah, but okay.
You can't go down the scroll bar. You pulled it down.
Okay. What about further development of Das? Thank you. Further maturity until the age of 25-40, minimal age of Kabbalah, study entry, no additional tool added, just expansion of existing. That's a great question, because I spoke about what this idea of Dat, this knowledge, this connection, as being a tool that comes out at 13. That expands. And the answer is yes, it expands. And the soul continues to expand. When we say that the soul fully enters the body and blossoms at age 12 or 13 for a girl or boy, it's that you have the tools. You don't have them in their final form, in their mature form, and it's up to us to try to expand it. And that, this idea of connection, is a critical a tool, a central tool within the Kabbalistic understanding of our personalities, being able to connect and things matter.
Since it mentions that they were 13 years old.
Yeah.
And they did something horrible, is it implied that when a child becomes 12 or 13, it's our responsibility to teach them how to control their emotions?
I think I don't use this
this
example.
what they're-
It absolutely is, and every bar mitzvah I also know this, that I mean, not these words exactly. When you're 10 years old, it's normal to think about, what are the consequences going to be, and to measure risk reward. If I do that, am I going to get punished or whatever? And if I'm not, if it looks good and it feels, and my friends are doing it, there's a pull there. At age 12 and 13, a girl or boy has the capacity to say, I have a conscience. What I'd say to them is the birth of moral conscience, and the capacity for self-discipline. And the capacity for self-discipline means that it's not that someone's threatening me with a punishment. It's not that someone's saying, don't do it. My friends are doing it. It looks fun. But the voice in my head tells me it's wrong. That means I have the capacity. Obviously, people can be 50, 70, and they still don't choose to listen to that voice. But at least the tool, the muscle of self-discipline kicks in at bar mitzvah.
Got a question. Basically, our actions are supposed to be guided by what is written in the Torah, divine law. All right, here comes the hooker.
Amen.
What do you do about, and you kind of touched on this, about a war which is considered immoral? How is one supposed to respond to that? The immorality being, for example, my age, Vietnam, in retrospect, was an immoral war. How do you get those two in sync?
I don't know that I have to justify Vietnam. I don't know. I was born in 1967, so I don't have that, the knowledge of it. I think that there were legal ways to protest the war. And I think if someone feels that the war was wrong, they had the moral obligation to exercise their right to let society in a legal way to protest it. Wars should be abhorrent to us. So, again, sometimes they're necessary. World War II was necessary.
It's necessary.
Usually you want it to be only defensive. But I don't have a problem with someone standing up and saying that the war is wrong. I don't. Again, I can have my own opinion. I don't know if it's necessarily. I don't get to say the Torah opinion in this situation. Like I say, I think it's hard for us. It should be hard for us. Like I was just talking with Malki about someone who a young person suffered a terrible tragedy in their family, and people are raising money for them. Now, these people they have more money than I'm ever going to have. But it's my only way of saying I care is sending them something. I call them. I don't want to intrude on them right now. Right now, it's something. There's a fund. I'm gonna give something to, because how do you stand by and not do something? How do I stand by and not do something? So that's the way I felt about Ukraine. Again, I'm not saying I'm right, but I just felt it's not like, well, there's something else must have happened. They must have instigated it. We all saw what was going on. So clearly not instigated by anything but I think a desire for power and land. How do we stand by? Anyway,
There are places in the Torah
we have a question here. Yeah.
where God said that you will go to these places and you will conquer them.
Yeah.
Which means
Yeah.
you go first. It's not defensive.
Oh, absolutely. In the times of the Torah, they weren't just offensive, but when God commands us to do another offensive war, we can do it. Otherwise, it's very hard to imagine any rabbinic permission for anything other than a defensive war. You can preempt like 67. You don't have to wait for them to shoot the bullet. You can, right? You can go and take out their airplanes before they take off, but not as an aggressive thing of trying to conquer another country. No. Now, once they started, then the Rebbe was saying go all the way to Damascus, because just for security purposes.
Well, wasn't all these commandments in the Torah for Israel?
Yeah,
Wasn't it?
Absolutely,
for them?
yeah.
So
But
the
someone might. I'm saying maybe you think that now we can't do it now. No, can't do that.
No.
Okay.
As long as we're talking about that, though, you have to consider the fact that in a lot of those biblical wars, non-combatants were murdered.
Absolutely. There's no question. And it's a sad thing, and it certainly happened, and it can't be whitewashed, but this is what God had said. That's the reason God tells King David he can't be the one to build the temple, because his hands are bloodied from war. Wars that God told him to do. He didn't do anything wrong. But his hands were bloodied, were tainted. Wish everyone a great week.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.